There is a particular quality of silence that belongs only to places where important things have been kept for a very long time. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is not the silence of a room between conversations. It is something older and more deliberate than either of those things. It is the silence of paper that has absorbed voices that were once urgent, once private, once belonging to people who had no idea that anyone beyond their intended reader would ever hold what they had written. It settles into the walls. It settles into the shelves. It settles, on certain days, into the people who come here to work. I have been the senior records archivist at Windsor Castle for 21 years. I have catalogued correspondence from 6 reigns. I have handled letters written in grief and in fury, and in the particular exhausted tenderness that only appears in the private writing of people who carry public lives. I have learned over those 21 years to move quietly in rooms like this one, to touch things with intention, to speak only when the room asks something of me. I did not expect, on the morning of the 14th of November, to leave the sub-basement reading room having learned something I could not have catalogued. But that is what happened, and I have thought about it nearly every day since. The sub-basement reading room at Windsor is not a room that appears in any official tour. It is 3 floors below the state apartments, accessible by a service lift that requires a key card and a second confirmation code, and it smells pleasantly. I have always thought of cedar wood and dry cotton and something faintly metallic that I have never been able to fully identify. The shelves are cream-painted steel, floor to ceiling, and the lighting is calibrated to preserve rather than illuminate. It is never bright in here. It is always, instead, the particular amber of late afternoon, regardless of what the actual time is. The reading table at the center of the room seats 6. On ordinary working days, there might be 2 of us, myself and one of my junior colleagues, working through whatever material has been flagged for reassessment. The work is slow by design. Speed is not a virtue in archival practice. Patience is. On the 14th of November, I was alone when the call came through from the equerry's office. His Majesty would be coming down at 11. He wished to look at the early correspondence boxes, specifically the pre-1930 material from the personal files of George V. He would be bringing a guest. The equerry's tone carried a particular careful neutrality that I have learned in this occupation to read correctly. The guest was Prince George. I had 40 minutes. I used them to pull 6 boxes from the shelf, the 3 most likely to contain what His Majesty would want, and 3 more that I felt, based on long experience, might be worth having near. I laid the boxes on the table. I set out the cotton gloves, 2 pairs, and then thought for a moment and added a 3rd smaller pair from the drawer where we keep them for younger visitors. I placed a notepad and 2 pencils. I filled the water carafe. I turned the lights up by a small degree, not bright, but less amber than usual. Then I waited. His Majesty arrived at 11 minutes past 11. He came in the way he always comes into this room, pausing just inside the door for a moment, not dramatically, but the way a person pauses when they are shifting from one mode of attention into another. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie. He looked at the boxes on the table and nodded once in a way that meant he recognized I had done the preparation correctly. He said good morning. I returned it. He asked whether the George V. correspondence included the personal rather than official files. I confirmed that it did. He nodded again and moved toward the table, and then he stopped, turned slightly, and said to the doorway, not to me, that it was all right to come in. There was nothing frightening about it. Prince George came in. He was wearing school clothes, dark trousers, a pale blue shirt with the collar open. He was carrying nothing. He looked at the room the way children look at rooms that are unfamiliar, a single slow scan, taking the measure of the space before committing to entering it fully. His eyes moved across the shelves, across the table, and then briefly to me. I gave him what I hoped was a professional but not unwelcoming nod. He returned it with the precise seriousness of a child who has been taught that this is the appropriate response to a professional nod from a stranger. He was, I noticed, wearing no watch. This struck me, for reasons I could not immediately explain, as significant. His Majesty gestured toward the chair to his left. George sat. His Majesty sat beside him. I moved to the end of the table where I customarily sit when a member of the family is working, close enough to assist but far enough to be, functionally, furniture. His Majesty reached for a pair of cotton gloves. He held them for a moment and then looked at his grandson. He said, "You'll need to wear these." George picked up his own pair and pulled them on without comment. They were slightly too large. He looked at his hands for a moment, the gloves pooling loosely around his fingers, and then he looked back at the boxes and he waited. I found that composure, in a child of his age, quietly remarkable. His Majesty opened the first box. The smell that comes from opened archive boxes in this room is different from the ambient smell of the room itself. It is closer, more specific. It carries the particular atmosphere of the decade it was sealed in, though I cannot explain that in any scientific terms. The 1910s smell different from the 1930s. I have no rational account for this. It is simply something I know. The first box contained correspondence from 1912 to 1915, mostly official, household management, estate queries, a significant quantity of letters regarding the arrangements for the funeral of Edward VII, which had been filed out of chronological order by a predecessor of mine, and which I had not yet had occasion to correct. His Majesty lifted the first bundle and set it on the table. He untied the ribbon, cream cotton, the standard we use for pre-war material, and placed the letters in a loose arc across the table. He picked up the topmost letter and read it in silence. Then he turned it over, checked the date, and set it aside. He picked up a second, read it, set it aside. Prince George watched this for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he leaned forward slightly and looked at the letter His Majesty had most recently set down. He said, quietly, "Who is that from?" His Majesty turned the letter to show him the signature. He said it was from a household official at Sandringham, a man who had managed the estate accounts. He said his name aloud. George looked at the signature for a moment. Then he said, "But he signed it with a different name here." His Majesty looked again at the letter. Then he looked at the signature on the second letter which he had set alongside it. He was quiet for a moment. He said slowly that they appeared to be from 2 different people. George said yes. He said the handwriting was also different, the loops on the capital letters. He pointed at 2 specific characters. He said one of them slanted left and the other slanted right, and that they could not be from the same hand. His Majesty looked at me. I looked at the letters. I confirmed, with the mild professional embarrassment of someone who had not caught this themselves, that Prince George was correct. The letters were from 2 different correspondents, likely a father and son, both serving in the same household role in overlapping periods. They had been filed together and over the years attributed collectively to a single name. His Majesty said to his grandson, "That was well spotted." George said nothing. He looked at the letters for another moment and then sat back in his chair, but he kept looking. The second box was opened at approximately 11:30. This one contained personal correspondence, a smaller bundle, tied more carefully than the first, with a second layer of acid-free tissue beneath the ribbon. These were letters exchanged between George V and members of his immediate family during the years 1913 and 1914. The tone shifted the moment His Majesty lifted the first sheet. I have read these letters in the course of cataloging. They are in the restrained vocabulary of a family that considered emotional expression a matter of careful management, unusually warm. His Majesty read the first letter and did not set it down immediately. He held it for a longer moment. Then he placed it on the table and picked up a small photograph that had been tucked inside the tissue. He looked at it. He said, with the mild confidence of a man examining his own family history, that he believed this was a photograph of his great-grandmother as a young woman, taken sometime before the First War. George leaned in and looked at the photograph. He said, after a moment's consideration, that he thought it was actually great-great-grandmother. His Majesty looked at the photograph again. He turned it over. On the reverse in pencil was a date, 1897, and a name, written in a hand I recognized as a later edition, catalogued by one of my predecessors in the 1960s. The name confirmed that Prince George was correct. His Majesty said that he stood corrected. George did not smile at this. He simply nodded, with the same careful seriousness with which he had entered the room, and returned his attention to the table. I want to be precise about what I observed over the next 30 minutes, because I think precision is the only honest approach to something that is difficult to describe accurately. Prince George did not fidget. This is unusual in children of his age in this room. The room asks a kind of stillness that most adults find tiring after an hour, and children typically manage it for 10 to 15 minutes before some physical restlessness begins to surface. He sat with his hands flat on the table, the oversized cotton gloves entirely still, and he looked at whatever was in front of him with a quality of attention that I can only describe as structural. He was not simply looking. He was understanding the shape of what he was looking at before deciding what it meant. At 20 minutes to 12, His Majesty opened a letter and read it, and then set it down in the middle of the table rather than to the side. This is, in my experience, a gesture that means the reader has found something they are not certain how to process. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, to himself as much as to either of us, that this one was unexpected. George looked at the letter. He asked if he could read it. His Majesty considered this for a moment. Then he said yes and slid it toward his grandson. George read it. He read it at a pace that told me he was reading every word rather than scanning, a pace that was, if I am being exact, slower than most adults read handwritten correspondence in this room, and considerably more thorough. When he finished, he placed the letter back on the table. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he was frightened, wasn't he? His Majesty asked who. George said the man who wrote this. He said you could tell because of the way the sentences kept starting and then changing direction. He said it was like someone who wanted to say something but kept finding a different way to arrive at it. I looked at the letter. He was not wrong. The letter was from a senior member of the household staff, written in the autumn of 1913, approximately 8 months before the outbreak of the war that would change the composition of that household permanently. The writer was a man who had served the royal family for over 30 years. He was writing, ostensibly, about a routine administrative matter. But the sentences did what George had identified. They began, turned, began again. The thing the man was actually trying to say was never fully said. His Majesty sat with this for a moment. Then he said, quietly, that yes, he thought that was probably right. George nodded. He looked at the letter one more time. Then he carefully slid it back to his grandfather's side of the table. At noon, His Majesty stood briefly to answer a call that came through his private secretary. He stepped into the corridor outside the reading room, leaving the door slightly ajar. I remained at my end of the table. Prince George remained in his chair. He sat in silence for a moment. Then he looked at me and asked, with the directness that I have come to understand is characteristic of him, whether the letters ever got answered. I told him that some did, that many were preserved without reply, that some replies existed in other boxes, filed under the recipient's name rather than the sender's. He thought about this. Then he asked whether anyone ever found both halves of the same conversation. I told him that sometimes, yes, that it was one of the more unusual experiences in archival work, to hold both letters, the question and the answer, written weeks or months apart by people who could not have known we would one day read them together. He looked at the boxes on the table. He said so they were still talking to each other, just slowly. I did not have an immediate response to this. I said, after a moment, that yes, that was one way to think about it. He nodded. He straightened his gloves. He looked back at the table and waited for his grandfather to return. His Majesty returned at approximately 7 minutes past noon. He sat back down, looked at the boxes, and pulled the third one, which had not yet been opened, toward him. He untied the ribbon. He removed the tissue layer. He lifted the first bundle of letters and placed it on the table. And then he paused. At the bottom of the box, beneath the bundled correspondence, there was a single letter that had not been tied with the others. It had been placed there, or had come to rest there over the years, separately from the main grouping. It was not in an envelope. It was folded in the manner of correspondence from that period in thirds, horizontally, and sealed with what appeared to have once been a wax seal, though the wax itself had long since crumbled. Someone, at some point in the intervening decades, had placed a small strip of acid-free tape across the fold to keep it closed. His Majesty looked at it. He looked at me. I told him I was not certain I had encountered this letter before. I looked at the box reference number and cross-checked it against my catalog on the laptop at the end of the table. The letter appeared in the catalog as a single line, undated personal correspondence, provenance uncertain, contents unverified. His Majesty picked it up carefully. He opened it along the taped fold. He read the first line, then he read it again. He said, "It doesn't appear to have a named recipient." I asked whether there was a salutation. He said yes, there was a salutation, but it was not a name. He turned the letter so I could read the opening line from where I sat. The salutation read, "To whoever is reading this next." His Majesty sat with this for a moment. He looked at the letter with the expression of a man who has encountered something that does not fit the category he brought with him. He said slowly that it appeared to have been misfiled, that it was likely intended for a different context entirely. He began to set it aside. George said, "Can I look at it?" His Majesty passed it to him. George read it. He read it entirely. The letter was, I could see from where I sat, 2 full pages, written on both sides. He read it without looking up. When he finished, he turned it over and read the second side again from the beginning. Then he placed it on the table. He said it wasn't misfiled. His Majesty asked what he meant. George said that the letter said, near the end, that it was being placed in a box with other correspondence from that year, so that it would be found by whoever came to look through the records. He said the writer had known it would not be read immediately. He said the writer had put it there on purpose, for someone in the future who would need to read it. His Majesty was quiet. George said, "I think it was for us." His Majesty looked at the letter on the table. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, carefully, that was one way to read it. George said, "What does it say?" His Majesty picked it up and read it again. Then he read certain passages aloud, not all of them, and not for my benefit, and I did not attempt to record them. What I can say is that the letter was written by a man who knew he was approaching the end of a long service, who was writing not to communicate information, but to communicate something less definable, a quality of feeling about the institution he had served, about its weight, about what it asked of the people inside it, about what it gave them in return that could not be named in any official correspondence. He was writing, it seemed clear, to someone he would never meet, someone he trusted on faith would eventually be sitting in a room like this one. His Majesty finished reading. He set the letter down. Prince George looked at it for a moment. Then he said, he wasn't frightened in this one. His Majesty looked at his grandson. George said, the sentences don't change direction. He knew what he wanted to say. His Majesty said after a pause, no, he supposed they didn't. The session ended at 12:30. His Majesty stood and removed his gloves and placed them at the side of the table. He looked at the boxes and asked me to flag the single undated letter for separate cataloging, not to file it back in the general grouping, but to give it its own reference, as a document of unusual provenance. He said he would like it noted in the record that the letter had been read on the 14th of November by himself and by Prince George, and that the contents were being considered for future reference. I made the notation. Prince George stood. He removed his gloves. He placed them neatly on the table, not dropped, not pushed aside, but placed deliberately in the same position they had been in when he arrived. He looked at the boxes for a moment. Then he looked at the one that had been retied, the ribbon refastened, the tissue replaced, and reached out and straightened it very slightly on the table so that it was square with the edge. His Majesty watched him do this. He said nothing. They left together, His Majesty first, George a step behind. At the door, George paused and looked back into the room, not at me, not at the table, but at the room itself. The same slow scan he had made on the way in. Then he turned and followed his grandfather into the corridor. The door closed behind them. I sat at the end of the table for a little while after they had gone. The amber light of the room did what it always does, held the atmosphere of whatever had happened here without commentary, without judgment. The boxes were on the table. The undated letter was separate from the others, as instructed. The two pairs of gloves were at opposite ends of the table. The third pair, the small pair, the ones that had been slightly too large, were folded neatly where Prince George had left them. I picked them up. I set them back in the drawer. I sat down again and opened my catalog and added the notation His Majesty had requested. I wrote it as precisely as I could, in the language of archival record, dates, names, reference numbers, condition notes. But I found, when I reached the description of the letter's contents and provenance, that the language I had available did not quite do the work I needed it to do. I wrote what I could. I noted that the letter appeared to have been placed intentionally rather than filed by standard procedure. I noted that the salutation suggested a future rather than a contemporary recipient. I noted that the condition of the paper and the character of the handwriting were consistent with the other correspondence in the box, placing it reliably within the pre-war period. And then I wrote, in the final line of the notation, which is the line reserved for contextual observations that do not fit the standard categories. Letter received and read by its intended recipients. Conversation continues. I have thought in the month since about what Prince George said when His Majesty was in the corridor. Not the observation about the letter's intent, though that was striking enough. What I have thought about is the smaller thing, the thing he said before any of the larger moments arrived. The thing he said when I told him that sometimes, yes, you could find both halves of a conversation in the archive. So they were still talking to each other, just slowly. He was 10 years old. He had been in the room for less than an hour. He was wearing cotton gloves that were too large for his hands. And he had understood, without being taught it, without being told it, without having read any literature on the subject of archival philosophy or the preservation of private correspondence, the essential thing about this work, the essential thing about these rooms, the essential thing, possibly, about the institution whose history lives in these boxes. That the conversations begun in this kind of paper do not end when the writer sets down the pen. That they wait. That whoever comes to read them next, whoever sits down in a room like this one, in whatever year, in whatever set of circumstances, becomes, at the moment of reading, the other half of a conversation that was always meant to continue. His Majesty has served for a long time. He has read a great deal of correspondence. He has sat in rooms like this one more times than I could catalog, and he has carried the weight of what he found in them with the particular careful endurance of a man who was raised to understand that the weight was part of the role. But he had not said that, not in those words, not in the 20 minutes before his phone call, while he was reading letters from men who were frightened, while he was being gently corrected about the identity of his own great-grandmother by a 10-year-old in oversized gloves. It was George who said it. And I have come to think that this is, in fact, precisely as it should be. History does not pass downward like an object handed from one generation to the next. It passes sideways, through paper, through rooms like this one, through the slow accumulation of conversations that refuse to end. And sometimes it waits, quite deliberately, it seems, for the right reader to arrive. The man who wrote that undated letter and placed it at the bottom of the box knew he would never know who found it. He trusted on faith that whoever came next would be ready. On the 14th of November, in the sub-basement reading room at Windsor Castle, in the amber light that is always the color of late afternoon, it appears he was right. There is a particular quality of silence that belongs only to places where important things have been kept for a very long time. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is not the silence of a room between conversations. It is something older and more deliberate than either of those things. It is the silence of paper that has absorbed voices that were once urgent, once private, once belonging to people who had no idea that anyone beyond their intended reader would ever hold what they had written. It settles into the walls. It settles into the shelves. It settles, on certain days, into the people who come here to work. I have been the senior records archivist at Windsor Castle for 21 years. I have catalogued correspondence from 6 reigns. I have handled letters written in grief and in fury, and in the particular exhausted tenderness that only appears in the private writing of people who carry public lives. I have learned over those 21 years to move quietly in rooms like this one, to touch things with intention, to speak only when the room asks something of me. I did not expect, on the morning of the 14th of November, to leave the sub-basement reading room having learned something I could not have catalogued. But that is what happened, and I have thought about it nearly every day since.